Every person alive today can trace their family tree back to the exact same small group of ancestors in Africa. Not similar ancestors, the same ones, which makes the next fact almost impossible to explain using common sense alone. Line up 10 strangers from 10 different corners of the world, and their skin can range from pale enough to burn in 15 minutes of sun to dark enough to handle 6 hours without a mark. One species, one shared starting point, and one visible trait that split further apart than almost anything else about us. For most of the last century, even scientists got the reason wrong. Then, in 2018, a skeleton pulled out of an English cave back in 1903 tore the old explanation apart when its DNA revealed skin nobody in the room expected on a face nobody thought would ever wear it. That single result forced researchers to admit they had misjudged the timeline of human skin color by tens of thousands of years. By the time this video ends, you will know exactly why your skin looks the way it does, and it has almost nothing to do with what you were taught in school. Let's start with the part that makes this whole question strange in the first place. Every person on Earth, regardless of what they look like, traces back to the same ancestral population in Africa. The fossil record, backed up by genetics, puts the origin of anatomically modern humans at roughly 300,000 years ago, with the oldest known fossils coming from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. From that single starting point, humans eventually spread into every corner of the planet, from the equator to the Arctic Circle. And here's the detail that trips most people up. Genetically, humans are remarkably uniform. Any two people you pick at random, no matter where they are from, share somewhere around 99.9% of their DNA. We are, biologically speaking, one of the least genetically diverse large mammal species on the planet. And yet skin color, one single visible trait, varies more dramatically across our species than almost any other physical characteristic we have. That mismatch is the actual mystery here. If we are this genetically similar, something had to be working incredibly hard and incredibly fast to make one trait look this different from population to population. That something turns out to be one of the most aggressive, most well-documented examples of natural selection acting on a mammal that scientists have ever mapped out. For most of recorded history, nobody actually knew the real reason for this variation, and the guesses people came up with instead reveal a lot more about human bias than human biology. Centuries ago, the physician Avicenna proposed that people living directly under the sun's zenith developed what he called a fiery humor, tying dark skin to temperament. In more recent centuries, some scientists tried to argue that skin color tracked directly with intelligence or moral character, building entire invented hierarchies with zero biological basis behind them. And for a long stretch of the 20th century, even serious researchers leaned on an explanation that sounds reasonable on the surface but falls apart the moment you check the numbers, the idea that dark skin evolved purely to prevent skin cancer. It took nearly a century of actual genetic and anthropological research to finally replace centuries of guesswork and bias with an explanation that is testable, predictive, and correct. To understand why, you have to go back further than skin color itself, back to the moment our ancestors lost something that almost every other primate on the planet still has: fur. Every ape alive today is covered in thick body hair. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all of them. And underneath that hair, their skin is actually pale. You can see it on a chimpanzee's face and hands, the parts that are already exposed to the air. That pale skin was never a problem for them because the fur was doing the protecting. Humans are the exception. At some point in our evolutionary history, we lost the thick coat almost entirely. And evolutionary biologists have a fairly solid explanation for why. Geneticist Alan Rogers and his colleagues at the University of Utah worked out that our ancestors likely became functionally naked because of heat management. Early hominins on the African savanna were covering long distances on foot in direct sun, chasing prey for hours at a time, something almost no other primate does. A thick fur coat traps heat close to the body. To survive that kind of physical exertion under an equatorial sun, the body needed a far more efficient cooling system, so we evolved an enormous number of sweat glands, more than any other primate by a wide margin. And sweat only cools you down efficiently if it can evaporate directly off bare skin instead of getting trapped in fur. But losing the fur created a brand new problem, because fur had been doing double duty this entire time. Yes, it trapped heat, which is exactly what we were trying to get rid of. But it was also blocking ultraviolet radiation from ever reaching the skin directly. Take the fur away, and suddenly bare skin is taking the full force of equatorial sunlight for the first time in the history of our lineage. That is where dark skin comes in. And this next part is where most people's assumptions turn out to be wrong, because dark skin did not evolve primarily to prevent sunburn, and it did not evolve to prevent skin cancer either. Skin cancer overwhelmingly strikes after reproductive age. So from evolution's cold, mechanical perspective, it barely exerts any pressure on which genes get passed down to the next generation. The real threat that shaped early human skin was happening on the inside of the body, somewhere you would never think to look. Ultraviolet radiation breaks down a nutrient called folate, a B vitamin that is essential for cell division. Folate is especially critical during pregnancy because it is required for the proper formation of a developing embryo's neural tube, the structure that eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. Severe folate deficiency during early pregnancy is linked to devastating birth defects. Folate also plays a direct role in sperm production in men. Researcher Nina Jablonski, a biological anthropologist who has spent decades chasing this exact question, found the thread that tied all of it together. She came across an older medical paper showing that intense sunlight exposure was linked to measurably lower folate levels in the blood. Put those pieces side by side and the picture becomes clear. Early humans in equatorial Africa, now bare-skinned for the first time in their lineage's history, were losing a nutrient essential for healthy reproduction every single day they spent exposed to the sun. Any individual whose skin happened to produce more melanin, the pigment that absorbs and scatters UV radiation before it can penetrate deep into the skin, would protect their folate levels and, by extension, protect their own fertility and the health of their future children. That is an enormous evolutionary advantage, the kind that spreads through a population fast. Rogers traced the specific mutation responsible for permanently dark, protective skin, a variant of a gene called MC1R, and estimated that it swept through the ancestral human population roughly 1.2 million years ago. That is long before Homo sapiens even existed as a species. Our direct ancestors had already evolved dark. UV-blocking skin is the default setting for a naked, sweating, upright ape living directly under an equatorial sun. So dark skin was not some later deviation from a paler original. Dark skin was the original human condition. That single fact already flips a lot of what people assume about this topic. There is a neat postscript to that MC1R story, and it explains something you have probably wondered about if you have ever met someone with red hair. That same gene controls a genetic switch between two different types of melanin. Eumelanin, the brown-black pigment behind tanned and dark skin tones, and pheomelanin, a red-yellow pigment that offers far less protection against UV radiation. In populations living under strong equatorial sun, MC1R variants that maximized eumelanin production were strongly favored for exactly the folate-protecting reasons we just covered. But in low UV environments, especially parts of northern Europe, that selective pressure essentially disappeared, and loss-of-function mutations in MC1R were free to spread without being weeded out. Some of those mutations shift pigment production toward pheomelanin instead, which is a large part of why red hair, pale freckled skin, and heightened sunburn sensitivity cluster so heavily in places like Scotland and Ireland, regions that receive some of the weakest, most indirect sunlight anywhere in the inhabited world. It is not a separate story from the one we have been building. It is the exact same gene, responding to the exact same pressure, just running in reverse once that pressure was no longer there to enforce it. Which raises the next obvious question. If dark, melanin-rich skin was the ancestral default for our entire species, why does most of the world not look like that today? Second, this is where the story becomes genuinely elegant, and it comes down to one researcher spending nearly a decade chasing a problem almost nobody else wanted to touch. In the early 1990s, Nina Jablonski, then working at a university in Australia, was asked to give a lecture on the evolution of human skin color. At the time, the leading theory floating around was still the skin cancer explanation, and Jablonski already suspected that explanation did not hold up, for the exact reason we just covered. Skin cancer simply does not kill people young enough, or often enough, to meaningfully shape evolution at this scale. She spent the next several years working alongside her husband and research partner, geographer George Chaplin, building something nobody had ever built before, a global map correlating skin color with actual, measured levels of ultraviolet radiation using satellite data originally collected by NASA. What they found, when they finally overlaid the two maps on top of each other, was almost unsettlingly precise. Human skin color across indigenous populations correlates with local UV radiation levels at a statistical strength of roughly 0.84 out of a possible 1.0. That is one of the strongest correlations ever demonstrated for any human physical trait. The darkest skin tones cluster almost exactly where UV radiation is at its most intense, near the equator, and skin gets progressively lighter the further you move toward the poles, with a handful of interesting exceptions in unusually cloudy or unusually high altitude regions, exceptions that Jablonski and Chaplin's model actually predicted correctly before they even checked. But Jablonski and Chaplin did not stop at explaining why skin got darker near the equator. They also had to explain the opposite pattern, why skin got so much lighter the further humans migrated away from it. And that answer involves the exact same ultraviolet radiation, just working through a completely different biological mechanism this time: vitamin D. Your body cannot get sufficient vitamin D from food alone, not reliably. It needs direct UVB radiation hitting the skin to trigger vitamin D synthesis in the first place, and vitamin D is essential for calcium absorption, healthy bone development, and a properly functioning immune system. Here is the actual trade-off at the center of this entire story. Melanin, the same pigment that protects folate near the equator, also blocks the UVB radiation your skin needs to make vitamin D. In a place like equatorial Africa, that is not really a trade-off at all, because there is more than enough sunlight year-round to make plenty of vitamin D even through darker, more heavily pigmented skin. But as humans migrated north into Europe and northern Asia, available sunlight got dramatically weaker, especially through long, dim winters, and skin that stayed heavily pigmented in that kind of environment simply could not let enough UVB through to make adequate vitamin D. Populations that developed lighter skin, letting more of that weak, low-angle sunlight through, could still synthesize enough vitamin D to stay healthy, while populations that remained dark, skinned in those low UV environments, were more prone to vitamin D deficiency, weakened bones, and reduced fertility over many generations. Jablonski and Chaplin called this a dual cline. Two separate evolutionary pressures pulling in completely opposite directions, both acting on the exact same physical trait. Near the equator, the fight against folate destruction pushed skin darker. Far from the equator, the fight for vitamin D synthesis pulled skin lighter. Human skin color, everywhere on the globe, settles at whatever point on that spectrum represents the best possible compromise between those two competing biological needs for that specific location, with that specific amount of annual sunlight. It is not random, it is not arbitrary, and it has nothing to do with which group of people is somehow more or less evolved. It is one of the cleanest, most mathematically precise examples of natural selection ever mapped onto a living human population. Jablonski herself gave a name to the entire visible spectrum of human skin color stretched across the globe. She calls it the sepia rainbow. It is worth sitting with how fast that mechanism can move, because it explains something you have probably experienced yourself without ever thinking about the biology behind it. Your own skin can adjust its pigmentation within your own lifetime, not through evolution, but through a short-term biological response called tanning, where existing melanin-producing cells ramp up production temporarily in response to sun exposure, then fade back down once that exposure stops. That is the exact same underlying chemistry that shaped entire populations over hundreds of thousands of years, just compressed into a scale you can watch happen over a single summer. If you want proof that this entire mechanism was never just an abstract theoretical model, history handed scientists an almost perfect real-world experiment, and it happened only a couple of centuries ago. During the Industrial Revolution, cities across northern Europe filled with thick coal smoke that blocked out a huge share of the sunlight reaching street level, on top of workers being pulled indoors into factories for most of daylight hours. The result was a rickets epidemic. Rickets is the bone disease caused by severe vitamin D deficiency, and by the late 1800s it was so widespread in industrial British cities that doctors nicknamed it the English disease, with some surveys from the period estimating that up to 80 or 90% of children in the worst affected neighborhoods showed some degree of it. Charles Dickens is widely thought to have based Tiny Tim, the sickly child in A Christmas Carol, on the bowed legs and stunted growth rickets left behind. When American cities industrialized in a similar way a few decades later, the same pattern showed up again, and it hit darker, skinned populations, including many Southern European and Black American communities living in those same smog-choked cities, noticeably harder, exactly what you would predict if melanin really was blocking a meaningful share of an already scarce UVB signal. It took until the early 20th century for researchers to properly connect the dots and realize the fix was shockingly simple: more sunlight exposure or vitamin D through food sources like cod liver oil. The English disease was not some mysterious modern ailment. It was the same equation Jablonski and Chaplin would map out roughly a century later: melanin against available UV, playing out in real time on the skeletons of children who never got to grow up in the sunlight their skin was originally built for. Now here is where the story moves from theory into hard, physical genetics, and it starts, of all places, with a fish tank. In the early 2000s, a cancer researcher named Cheng at Pennsylvania State University was not even studying human skin color. He was studying zebrafish, a small striped fish widely used in genetics labs because its embryos are transparent and its genome shares a surprising amount of overlap with our own. Cheng's team was working with a mutant strain of zebrafish nicknamed golden, because instead of the usual dark stripes, these fish had noticeably lighter, washed-out pigmentation. Out of scientific curiosity, Cheng decided to track down exactly which gene was responsible for the golden mutation. His team isolated it, a gene called SLC24A5, and what they found next reportedly made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. When they looked at the human version of that same gene, they discovered a nearly identical kind of mutation: a single change in one amino acid that was extremely common in people of European descent and almost completely absent in people of West African descent. To confirm the connection wasn't a coincidence, they inserted the working human gene into the golden zebrafish embryos, and the fish's dark pigmentation came right back. A gene discovered almost by accident in a fish tank turned out to be responsible for roughly a third of the visible skin tone difference between people of European and West African ancestry, all traceable to a single letter change in the genetic code. The study was published in the journal Science in 2005, and it remains one of the clearest examples in all of genetics of how one tiny mutation can ripple outward into a trait as visible and as socially loaded as human skin color. Here's where it gets even stranger, because SLC24A5 is not the whole story, not even close. If you assumed that every population with lighter skin around the world arrived there through the exact same genetic route, you would be wrong. And the way scientists figured that out is one of the more elegant plot twists in this entire field. Researchers studying East Asian populations went looking for that same SLC24A5 variant that lightens skin in Europeans, and it was barely present at all. Instead, they found a completely different gene doing almost the same job. A specific mutation in a gene called OCA2, present at high frequency across East Asian populations and almost entirely absent in both Europeans and Africans, was independently linked to lighter skin. In other words, light skin in Europe and light skin in East Asia are not the same adaptation, inherited from some shared ancestor who happened to have pale skin. They are two separate evolutionary experiments, running on two different continents, arriving at a similar visible outcome through completely different genetic machinery. Third, biologists call this convergent evolution, when unrelated populations facing a similar environmental pressure, in this case weak sunlight at high latitude, independently stumble onto separate genetic solutions to the exact same problem. It is the same underlying logic behind bats and birds, both evolving wings despite branching off from entirely different ancestors millions of years apart. And the twists do not stop there. In 2018, researchers studying the Khoisan people of southern Africa, one of the most ancient and genetically distinct human populations on the planet, found that a meaningful portion of them carry a lighter skin variant of that same SLC24A5 gene originally identified in Europeans. For a moment, That looked like it might be evidence of relatively recent mixing with European colonizers. But when the genetics team dug into the data more closely, they found something far more interesting. That gene variant had not arrived from Europe at all. It had spread into southern Africa from populations in East Africa, and the genetic evidence pointed to that spread happening within roughly the last 2,000 years, an almost instant time frame by evolutionary standards. Individuals in the study who carried 2 copies of that variant were measurably lighter skinned than the population average. It is now considered one of the clearest documented examples of an active, ongoing pigmentation adaptation happening inside a modern human population. Not something frozen in our deep evolutionary past, but something that was still actively reshaping a population within the last couple thousand years, roughly the same span of time separating us from the Roman Empire. There is one more twist buried in your own DNA, and it comes from a species that is not even Homo sapiens. Modern humans of non-African descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, the leftover result of interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago. And when geneticists went looking for where that Neanderthal DNA actually survived inside the modern human genome, one of the strongest, most consistent signals they found was clustered around a gene called BNC2, which directly influences skin pigmentation. Close to 70% of people of European descent carry a Neanderthal-derived version of this gene, and it is linked to increased sunburn risk and reduced tanning ability. A smaller, separate Neanderthal haplotype near the same gene is linked in the opposite direction, toward darker pigmentation. Scientists believe Neanderthals, who had already been living in Europe's low sunlight environment for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived, had already evolved skin well suited to that specific climate. When the 2 populations interbred, some of those already optimized genetic solutions got folded directly into the modern human gene pool, a kind of evolutionary shortcut, borrowing pigmentation adaptations that had already been tested and refined by an entirely different human species. Which brings us to the twist that genuinely upended everything scientists thought they understood about the timeline of all of this. And it starts with a skeleton discovered in a cave in the south of England back in 1903. The skeleton became known as Cheddar Man, named after Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, where he was found. He is the oldest, nearly complete human skeleton ever discovered in Britain. And for most of the 20th century, scientists simply assumed he looked roughly like a modern white Brit because he lived in Britain, and modern Brits have light skin, so why would it be any different? In 2018, researchers from University College, London, and the Natural History Museum finally extracted and sequenced his full genome, the oldest complete human genome ever recovered from British remains. What they found did not match that assumption at all. Cheddar Man had dark, likely black, skin. He also had strikingly blue eyes and dark, curly hair. And crucially, he was not some rare outlier. Subsequent genetic surveys of other skeletons from the same period across Western Europe show the same pattern repeating. Dark skin, paired with blue or green eyes, appears to have been the norm for hunter-gatherers across most of Europe as recently as 10,000 years ago. Researcher Tom Booth at the Natural History Museum put it bluntly. Scientists had simply always assumed that humans adapted to pale skin quickly after arriving in Europe around 45,000 years ago. Cheddar Man proved that assumption was off by tens of thousands of years, and it gets even more recent than that. A later study out of the University of Ferrara analyzed genetic data from hundreds of ancient skeletons across Europe, spanning roughly 45,000 to 1,700 years ago, and found that many of the people who built Stonehenge, roughly 5,000 years ago, likely still had dark skin. Light skin, the trait most people today automatically associate with deep, ancient European ancestry, may not have become the dominant look across most of the continent until sometime well after that, arguably within the last several thousand years, a genetic eye blink compared to the 300,000-year story of our species as a whole. So think about what that actually means. The version of skin color most people picture when they imagine ancient Europeans, ancient Britain, even the people who built one of the most iconic prehistoric monuments on the entire planet, is almost certainly wrong. Skin color, across the whole human species, has been shifting, reshuffling, and re-evolving far more recently, and far more rapidly, than almost anyone assumed, right up until shockingly recent history. None of this stopped moving once written history began, either. Global migration over just the last few centuries has scattered skin tones into UV environments they were never actually shaped for. Millions of people with skin adapted for equatorial sunlight now live in cities like London, Toronto, or Melbourne. And doctors still see meaningfully higher rates of vitamin D deficiency in those populations today, an echo of the exact same rickets story from a century earlier. Meanwhile, plenty of people with skin adapted for the dim light of Northern Europe now spend their lives in Florida, Dubai, or an artificially lit tanning bed, and dermatologists see the other side of that same coin, sharply elevated skin cancer rates. Your skin color is still calibrated to wherever your ancestors happened to spend the last several thousand generations. Most of us, at this point, simply do not live there anymore. So where does that leave us? All the way back at the start of this video, we set up a mystery. If every human being descends from the same African population, and if we are genetically almost identical to one another, why does skin color look this different across the world? The answer is that skin color is one of the fastest evolving, most environmentally reactive traits in the entire human body. It is not a marker of deep ancestry, and it is definitely not a reliable marker of how closely related two people actually are to each other. Population geneticists have measured this directly, and the finding consistently surprises people the first time they hear it. Back in 1972, evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin analyzed genetic markers across major human population groups and found that roughly 85% of all human genetic variation exists within any single population, not between different populations, a result that has held up remarkably well in every larger genomic study run since. Two people from the same village can, in some cases, be more genetically different from each other than one of them is from someone living on the opposite side of the planet. Skin color sits right on the surface, a couple of millimeters thick, shaped by an intense, localized tug-of-war between two invisible forces, protecting folate near the equator and enabling vitamin D everywhere else. Everything underneath that thin surface layer, the vast majority of what actually makes you human, is close to identical across every single person on this planet. That golden zebrafish in a lab in Pennsylvania. That gene that spread across southern Africa in only 2,000 years. That fragment of Neanderthal DNA still sitting in modern European genomes. That skeleton in a cave in England with skin nobody expected. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from different angles, about a species that spread itself across every climate on Earth and adapted, piece by piece, gene by gene, to survive in every single one of them. Skin color was never about identity. It was never about where you belong or how different you are from the person standing next to you. It was always just biology solving one very specific, very physical problem, sunlight, in dozens of different local ways, at dozens of different points in time. And the deeper science digs into it, the more it keeps confirming the same underlying truth. Underneath the sepia rainbow, we are all running the exact same